Hey friends, welcome back to Highwheel Woodworks. I'm Tim Eggers. We're starting a new series on how to make a simple keepsake box. We're going to teach you how to make neat boxes to keep your special treasures and your keepsakes in. It's going to be a series, so go ahead and hit the subscribe button so you can follow along. In that series, we're going to make a little more complicated boxes. We're going to talk about making the lids for them and how to put different types of legs on them. So basically how to embellish everything. So follow along as we go through. We're going to get started today making a simple keepsake box. So as we begin making our keepsake box, I'm going to assume that you've got your material prepared. We're going to use some walnut for this one, so I'm going to assume that you've taken your rough sawed lumber, you've run it through the jointer to clean up a face, you've run it over the jointer to get an edge nice and straight, and then we've run it through our thickness planer to get the desired thickness that we want, and we've run it down on our table saw to get the width of our piece that we want. So we've got it basically surface four sides, and we're ready to take it over to our miter box and cut the miter joints that we're going to use to put our box together with. So join me over at the miter saw. So we're over here at our miter saw because we're going to cut 45-degree miters on our piece to put those corners together. You'll notice that the saw is always locked down, which is where it should be when it's not in use. We simply go down here and to release that in a second. But what we want to do is I want to put a stop block up here so I can get the outside of my box to be exactly the same if it's going to be square all four sides around. So I'm going to lock my blade down as it is. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to measure this stop. I'm going to get it up to 8 inches. That's where the outside dimension of our box needs to be. I'm going to drop my clamp first, just to show you that I can in fact hit the floor on the first try. We're going to go ahead and lock this down. And then when I pull my pin, release my head, now I've got 8 inches between the end of my stop and my blade. So when I turn it over here to a 45-degree angle that we're going to use, all of my sides on the outside will be exactly 45 degrees and they'll all be exactly 8 inches. So our box is going to end up really nice and square. So I'm going to take my material that we've got over here. First thing I need to do is get an initial 45-degree angle started on the first of our pieces. So I'm going to set that such that my outside of my box is facing me. I'm going to come up here, bring this down at 45. And you'll notice when I made that cut, my hand holding the piece stayed in place. My hand holding the carriage down stayed in place. I released the switch after I made the cut, and I waited till that blade came to a complete stop before I picked it up and moved it out of there. And the reason for that is simply safety. If my hand is over here holding my stock and my other hand is here on the head, guess where it can't get? It can't get down in there where the blade is. So take enough time, be patient enough to let it come to a complete stop before you bring it back up and extract your piece. Again, learn that patience. Let that blade come to a stop before you move anything. That's one thing about being in any type of a shop where you have power equipment. If you don't learn patience in that environment, you're going to become the patient in that environment. Our last cut, here we go. And when you're preparing your stock to make your box, make a little bit extra. In case you mess up one piece, you'll have enough to go ahead and correct any errors that might come into play. When we're done cutting our pieces, simply lock the headpiece down again into that position. That's the safest place for it to be when it's not in use. Join me in a second over at the table saw and we'll put a dado in the bottom of these to hold our bottom. Yeah, so now we're over here at the table saw. In the bottom of our box, we're going to put a shelf in there, so we've got to run a dado through the bottom of it, and then we'll run a rabbet in the top of it to hold the lid down. So I've set my saw up to where I've got about a 1/4 inch of depth in the, coming in for that dado, and then I've got my top of my box over next to the fence, and I've got about a 1/4 of an inch of the bottom sticking out beyond the blade. So I'll run that through, then we'll open up that cut a little bit in order to make sure that we fit for the bottom that's going to go in our box. One thing you always want to do is always have a push pad. I don't like to do anything without them. I don't want my hands getting anywhere close to that, so I'll either use a pad like this, or sometimes I'll use a push stick like this. It's just depending on the size of the piece that I'm working on, but I'm going to go with this one. And you'll notice I'm standing off to the left a little bit of the fence, so when I'm pushing this through, I want my forearm to be pointed at the fence and at the deck, so my piece will stay nice and tight to the fence. And if anything does go bad, my hand will trip out over the fence versus going anywhere near the saw blade. So here we go. We're going to run these through real quick, and then we'll reset the saw and hit them again. And something you'll notice there is I have a real good outfeed table set up on my saw, so everything got pushed right out onto the outfeed table. I didn't have to go out there and try to retrieve it right after the cut while the blade is still going. So obviously I'm not going to go after any of my cut pieces until that blade comes to a complete stop. We've retrieved our cut-off pieces, and we know that the kerf of our blade is such that our bottom piece doesn't quite fit in there. So I'm simply going to make another pass at it. I'm going to move my saw, or my fence rather, in about 1/8 of an inch, and then I'm going to go ahead and run them again to make sure that they're going to make that cut and open it up just enough to get our piece in there. And there we've got our multiple passes to get our dado just enough for our bottom of our box to sit in there real nice with a little bit of margin in it. So we've got the bottom of our box cut and ready to go. Now I want to put a bit of a rabbet on the top for the lid to sit down in. So I'm going to reset my saw. I'm going to bring my fence over just so I'm just barely touching that top. We'll leave the depth of cut exactly the same, and we'll make a couple passes this way as well. So we'll get close on what this dadoed is, and then we'll show you what the rabbet does as well. So let's cut the rabbet out of it. That's plenty of rabbet for our top to sit in down there. So we are done at the table saw. Join me back over at the workbench, and we'll show you how to prep these by sanding them, and then we'll go back to cutting our bottom out. We'll glue them together. So when it comes time to cut the bottom that's going to go into our box, we've got our dado across here. We need to figure out how long those pieces need to be. They're going to be square because all of our pieces are the same length. So what I always do is I take my tape measure and I put it in right at the end of that dado at the deepest spot. Come out to the other end, and I can see at the deepest it's about 7 3/16, and then at the very top of it it's about 6 15. So I'm going to go about halfway between those two, and I'm going to make my pieces about 7 1/16 of an inch long. So that'll give us a little bit of margin for error and just a little bit of wiggle room in the bottom of our box. So we've determined that the bottom of our box needs to be 7 1/16 of an inch square. So on my gauge here for my fence, I can simply go over on the gauge there. I can set that at 7 1/16. I can look at my bottom compared to my blade. My blade's high enough on there. I can simply go ahead and cut this to make it square for the bottom of our box. Here we go. Backside to pull this out. And again, with my push pad on there. And pretty soon now, my 7 1/16 is going to be a perfect fit going into the rabbet that's going to contain the bottom of our box. Alright, so we've got our materials all prepared. We've got our 45 miters cut on all of our corners. We made sure they're perfectly square because we put a stop on the miter box. We went and we cut a dado in the bottom that's going to hold the bottom of our box here. And on our top side, we put a little bit of a rabbet in there so that'll accept the top that we're going to put on. Before we assemble this though, we've got to sand it because once it's together, it's pretty tough to sand. We're going to just take the random morbid disc over it real quick. And we're not looking for perfection there. We're not going to let perfection get in the way of plenty good enough. We've sanded the inside of it. I like to take a hand sander and this edge here on the inside, just hit that just to knock the sharp off of it a little bit. Again, because it's going to be real difficult to sand once we get it all assembled. I'm going to do the bottom of the dado as well. Our pieces there is sanded. I've already sanded both sides of the bottom of our box. Again, difficult to get to once it's final assembled. So sand all the inside pieces before you go to final assembly. So we're at the glue up portion of today's adventure. Regular, good old everyday Type Bond glue. I like to spread it out on my glue block. And then I like to brush it on. The thing that's important about this is when you're brushing it on, get it on about the outside 2/3 of that joint. I don't want to get all the way down in here to the center of it, because when I squeeze it together in the clamping process, I don't want that glue to bleed out into the inside of my box. So I go with about the outside 2/3 and try to avoid the area up here near the rabbet on the top, because we don't want glue coming out into the box there either. Take a brush, take it off of my glue block like this. Easiest way to control where your glue is going to go is to get this brush on there. And it doesn't need to be a ton of glue on there. We've got to make sure we've got enough to hold it together. There's not going to be a whole lot of stress or strain on any of these joints because it's a simple keepsake box, but we want to get enough on there to hold it. Don't have quite enough on my glue block yet, so we'll put a little more to that. I've been using the same glue block now for years. It's kind of neat to see how it's grown on its own. There we go. We've got our glue on there. Now we're ready to go. Let's set this aside. Let it do its thing. I like to take my box, get the side of my bottom that I want to be up, slide it in there, slide it into here, grab my other two sides, slide them together like that, pinch it in there, and I use either a band clamp, or if the box is small enough, infinitely variable adjustable band clamps. Most people call them rubber bands, but not woodworkers. You get that on there, hold this all in place, pull this nice and tight on there together, clamp it down, push it down, make sure that it's nice and flush on the bottom to the bench. Glue catalyzes by virtue of pressure. It's not necessarily a drying action. It's pressure that causes it to catalyze. So you've got to put enough pressure on there to get the job done. This Type Bond 2 works really, really well. Lines up really, really good. There, now I've got my glue blocks, or my box rather, all glued up and ready to go. It can sit there for a couple hours before we do anything with it. So we have our box all banded together and glued up. Now we're going to put a simple top in it that'll just be held in by gravity. So I'm taking that rabbet that we made in the top, I'm going to measure across, and I'm going to see that I've got 7 3/16 there. So I'm going to go to the table saw and I'm going to cut our top piece down to about 7 1/8 square and fit it back in there. Okay, we're done with our cuts on our table saw. Safety wise, best thing to always do is lower your blade below the top of the deck. Always, if you don't have a guard on, bring your fence over, lock it down over the blade. That way nobody can walk into your shop, hit the button by accident or on purpose, and have an exposed blade running. So for safety's sake, always lower your blade, cover it up with the fence. So our glue joints have set up on our box real well. We've been over to the table saw. We've cut our top to fit into our rabbets. We're simply going to drop it in there. Sits in there real nice like that. Just a little bit of wiggle room in there. And there we've got our simple, very basic keepsake box. In the series that are coming up, the episodes that are coming up, we're going to show how to embellish this, put handles on it, put legs on it, and all this. So go ahead and subscribe and take a look at what we're going to do for keepsake boxes. There's going to be a whole lot of creative ideas on how to embellish them and make them pretty neat. So thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next time around. Thank you much.